Go to any old newsroom of the Calgary Herald, the Edmonton Journal, Ottawa Citizen, any of these things, except for the CBC, because it's paid for by government, they're all emptied out. These are ghost buildings.
Adam Soos here for Rebel News with a man who needs no introduction, but I'll introduce him anyways. Derek Fildebrandt, the boss at the Western Standard, so to speak. One of the outlets certainly seeing a lot of growth by a strong contrast to what we've seen in some of the mainstream media and legacy outlets. I kind of wanted to ask first off your opinion. Obviously, you brought the Western Standard back to life. What did you see as a sort of journalistic responsibility that mainstream media outlets were maybe failing at that inspired you, and you saw that there was a need for the Western Standard to return?
Well, I used to not always bash mainstream media. I mean, I think the old Sun papers used to do a great job. You know, the Calgary, so the whole Sun chain had viewed itself as its primary role was challenging power, and to a degree, the old mainstream used to do that. But then I just started getting a weird feeling that media became maybe reporting some of the inside horse race of politics, but then more or less supporting government narratives, not challenging power. And you saw that in its most extreme form during COVID, where they saw themselves as not a check on power, a watchdog on power, but as the messenger of proper information. But when we brought the Western Standard back, that was pre-COVID. One of the big drivers was the big driver there was a lack of a Western perspective. Media consolidation in Canada means that almost everything's owned by one of three big companies. So in Alberta, you have the four major daily papers: Calgary Sun, Calgary Herald, Edmonton Sun, Edmonton Journal. And all four of them are owned by one company, Post Media. And Post Media is owned by the Chatham Management Group out of New Jersey. So we don't even have a single major Alberta-owned Alberta media organization here, or at least we didn't at the time. And so at that point, it was much more of a regional void that I was seeing. And there's been a real flowering of independent media outlets, like the Rebel and True North and whatnot that preceded us here. But I saw some space kind of between the mainstream media and some of the independents. I like the feistiness and the fearlessness of the independent media, but I am a bit of a sap for some kind of the format of the old mainstream, the way you see with the Calgary Herald and stuff. So I saw space kind of between the independents and the mainstreams that I wanted to fill, and I remembered how powerfully the Western Standard used to fill that. When your boss used to be the boss of the Western Standard, the role that filled, and he was coming in the tradition of Ted Byfield in the Alberta Report, which is now a sub-publication of the Western Standard we brought back as well. And so it was just that tradition of independent, bold Western media from the Alberta Report and the first Western Standard. And it was just crying out for someone to bring it back, and that's what we wanted to do.
You talked a little bit about there, and we say this all the time, that we're not accountable to the politicians. In fact, our job is to hold them accountable. Very traditionally, from the Woodward and Bernstein sort of tradition of holding politicians accountable, or at least making people aware of what politicians are doing. Do you feel that very often, particularly under Justin Trudeau, but the legacy media, mainstream media, they're sort of faltering in that primary responsibility as journalists?
Well, that's their number one job to do. As I was saying earlier, it's to be a check on power, to hold the powerful to account, both in government. It could be big government, big unions, big business, the powerful in general, and you really saw the media exposed for what it was. And I think the quality of it degenerate to unprecedentedly low levels of quality during COVID-19, when it wasn't, the government would make an announcement and they'd put out some statistics and they'd put out a policy. Traditionally, when the government puts out numbers and policies, the role of the media is to say, okay, are the facts that the government put out correct? Are those truly factual? And is this a appropriate policy response? The media paid zero attention whatsoever to this. And they took as just granted, they took it as, from heaven, that the facts that the government's put out are factual. They don't need to be checked because they are the experts. That means they are the facts. And the policies, well, I just say this. It's strange that people who, think a man can become a woman are the same people telling us to follow the science when it comes to COVID stuff. There was they felt no need to examine critically the policy responses of government. And Additionally, they saw it as not their role to check the power of government, but to convey the correct information as they believed it to be, uncritically, to the people. They were messengers of government, government to the people, not holding government accountable on behalf of the people. And it was a total role reversal of the media.
Well, the notion of science, it's sort of a process of discovery. It's not a trust the science. That's the most anti-scientific sentiment you could echo. Question the science is the scientific approach. And certainly I'd agree that they ignored that evidence substantially, and we've seen sort of the narrative shift towards perhaps what some of your reporters or us have been recanting or at least putting out there from some alternative perspectives. Now, the other thing that they didn't pay any attention to is a series of events and protests. Very often when we're out there covering protests with thousands of people, covering events at the court right next to, say, a City News head office, where hundreds of people were protesting.
Right down the road, about 200 meters up.
I would very often see Western Standard reporters. I would see True North reporters. Sometimes Rebel would be there, but the mainstream media outlets, they simply were not there. Why do you think there's this unwillingness to just cover certain events when they are mainstream news, and should be mainstream news rather?
I think it wasn't fitting the narrative. It's that anyone who would oppose this is just clearly the fringe. And you go to those events, there were a couple fringy people there, and you look at them and say, tinfoil hats on a little tight. But the vast majority were pretty normal, everyday people. Martha's and Henry's, as Ralph Klein called them. And showing this and giving it a fair hearing, I think, would contradict the official narrative. And I think, speaking to, and there are some good mainstream media journalists out there, and I've tried to understand where they're coming from. And some of the people in there, I'd say the holdouts, the dissidents, the few remaining, the remnant in the mainstream media who are the good guys, they put it to me this way, that they felt that reporting on the dissidents, the people who oppose these things, was a public danger, that they could kill people by reporting on views and perspectives and dissent that didn't correspond with what they thought was correct, because we're trusting the authorities. And so by giving airtime to this, you could actually harm someone. You could end up indirectly killing people because you're giving air to these people who want to, from their perspective, weaken public health measures, weaken mandates, and these things that are saving lives. So from their perspective, they were doing a public good. They were doing a public service by not giving appropriate attention to this. Or if it got to the point where there was just no choice but to give public attention to it, you had to shine a light only on the most crazy and extreme. And I think it is fair to shine a light on the most crazy and extreme. I mean, I'd like to, on the other side too, like, look at these nutters. You guys do it, we do it. But you try to give a bit more balance, that like, okay, well, what proportion of this crowd is the tinfoil hats, people on the left or the right, and what proportion are just more or less normal people expressing themselves?
Well, and it's interesting because that's very similar to what Jason Kenney said, political consequences be damned, I'm doing this to save lives, all that sort of stuff. And that would be true if we weren't also seeing sort of ideological overt lies. I'm sure you've seen and your reporters have come back to you, but I can think of a story where there was a Cuban protest with a large group of people literally protesting against the regime, calling for an end of communism. Mainstream media, numerous outlets, I believe it was Global and CBC, both ran a story saying they were protesting for vaccines for Cubans. How many stories do you have like this that are just not at all what happened, and there's no justification?
God, I mean, the last 2.5 years have just been bonkers. I'd say at the minimum dozens, if we were to run through dozens like that, possibly more. But that was one of the most wild examples. People protesting against communism, and they said yes, they're protesting because they want vaccines. And remember, the media also conflated early on in the Freedom Convoy. They said these truckers who are beginning in Alberta and BC, they're protesting because they want better infrastructure or something. No, they want the right to use the infrastructure because it's illegal to do it. So they outright lied about what it was, and they conflated it with other things. And then, that narrative got away from them, and all of a sudden they play the last card they got left. They're racists. And that's inevitably what they're going to get to. Just the cycle, in the news cycle, about how long it takes to get to calling someone a racist, it just gets shorter and shorter. Like, where you can pretty much just on day one, someone you disagree with can be instantly a racist. It used to take a while to, you used to have to do some research and find one unsavory character in there somewhere, and you could point to them. Now you can just say, oh, well, Yeah.
Well, and then you have people like Dr. Leslie Lewis and so on saying, well, no, I was with them and that was not my experience whatsoever. One thing we've certainly noticed is an increase, and it's organic. We didn't push it by any metric, but an increase in diversity of folks attending these protests, often people from countries that endured government overreach, whether that be Europe, Vietnam, other countries, but often people of diverse backgrounds are the ones who are first and foremost among these protesters. Now, the flip side of not covering those stories or lying about those stories is the super concentrated coverage of relatively small events. I know there was one sort of environmentalist event with 12 people there, and every mainstream media outlet is there pointing cameras on the 6 people, trying to make it look like as many people as possible. Hundreds of people show up and they pack up their cameras and leave. Have you guys witnessed that as well?
Yeah, I think there's been cases where I've had reporters out, and you guys have been there, and these things are happening. Remember, we'd have Dr. Crazy Joe Vipond just right down there. You can actually see the park in front of the McDougall Center. You can see right from the window here. You know, he'd be sitting there, and he'd have masks on like Darth Vader. You know, and the media would try to find the right camera angle to make it look like there's this big uprising. Everybody wants to be locked down. So lock me harder down. Lock me harder, daddy. You know, that kind of stuff. Well, I'd send a camera and, well, we'd show them and then we'd zoom out and it'd be like maybe 24 people. Yeah. Sure, fine. But like, you know, let's show that. But, you know, then you'd see in contrast, you know, like, so they try to make it look like a big gathering if it's against lockdown, for lockdowns. Hard to believe anyone would protest to get locked down and gather in close quarters to do so. That seems interesting. But then, you know, you had the Freedom Convoy. They'd say it's a small fringe minority. And like that may have been the words of Justin Trudeau, but that was more or less a message taken to heart by the media and more or less translated through, maybe using different language. But this was a massive thing. And it's just always downplayed. And
we're talking literally like 7. There was some people had higher estimates. Some people said hundreds, but I mean there was at least 7,000 for sure. We did a pretty detailed count. Media reported hundreds. That's not an accident. No. And I suppose the next question I wanted to ask is, I should just add to that. Once it became clear that this was a big thing, like they're there and they're visibly there, streets full of people in downtown Ottawa, outside, you know, along Wellington there, then the message just pivoted to, oh my God, Canada must be so irredeemably racist and fascist. Look how many of these terrible lunatics are here. So it's first, they don't exist. Then they exist, but they're a small fringe minority. Okay, fine, there is a lot of them. But that just means that Canada is irredeemably racist because there's so many people who are here. It's like a switch. They're flipping between they don't exist or they're the overwhelming majority and they're all racist and they need to be stopped. Now, I think we probably answered this already, but is this sort of lack of honoring that journalistic integrity and that journalistic responsibility, is it all are they lazy? Is it all ideologically driven? What's your impression? This is all just about getting handouts from the government. What do you think is sort of the few core factors contributing to it?
It's a few things. One is, I think there is a degree of laziness. You know, every generation thinks the generation below them is lazy and lacks work ethic. And I think that's sometimes true. So I think, there is some lazy people in it, but not everyone there is lazy. But I think a lot of it is newsrooms are overstretched. There's just no, if you go to any old newsroom of the Calgary Herald, the Edmonton Journal, Ottawa Citizen, any of these things, except for the CBC, because it's paid for by government, they're all emptied out. These are ghost buildings. The Calgary Herald isn't in its own building. They went to a much, much smaller one. So there's just not a lot of people covering these things now, and so they're overstretched. And that means maybe the people aren't lazy, but you get lazy journalism. It's just, well, here's a news release. I guess I need to put out a story, so I'm just going to copy this here, call this guy up for comment, put it out, boom. I did my job for the day. Pay me. Because there's not the resources to do a lot of good investigative journalism. And I'll tell you, just from a business perspective, investigative journalism doesn't really pay for itself. Just the business model doesn't work anymore. We still do it at the Standard, but I more or less just take a loss on it because I think it's just a value we should be doing. But I'd like to do a lot more of it. But if it's all we did, well, we'd be bankrupt. We'd have no business left. And the Standard already went down once. I'm not letting it happen again. Another is the consolidation of media. I was talking before, in Alberta, there's 4 major dailies. Every single one of them is owned by Post Media in Toronto, and Post Media in Toronto is owned primarily by the Chatham Management Group in New Jersey. you've got massive consolidation. So, if you're getting your news about what's happening on Parliament Hill today, so there's going to be a Post media reporter on Parliament Hill. Say you're in Edmonton, you're reading the Edmonton Journal, the Edmonton Journal, Edmonton Sun, you're getting the exact same content now. Just one opens like this, and the other one kind of folds and then opens and whatever. They're almost exactly the same, except one you get one you get Rick Bell, one you don't.
Yeah.
But your reporter is Post media on Parliament Hill. He doesn't really work for the Edmonton Journal. He's working for Post media. There's a good chance he's never visited Edmonton in his life.
Yeah.
Yet you're getting your political news there. So it's hyper concentrating the perspectives that come, and that's one of the reasons we created the Standard, is because we needed that Western perspective, and even we'd have to do some degree of consolidation to make the economics of this work. Media subsidies. If you want to destroy an industry, subsidize it.
Yeah.
You make it lazy. You make it fat. You make it uncompetitive, and that is exactly the media industry was already going down. They were getting the crap kicked out of them on advertising revenue. That the newspaper industry in North America started to die the day Kijiji came out, or what was it? Craigslist killed them, because all of a sudden classifieds were gone.
Yeah.
Who cared about classifieds? And then it went down and down from there. Now you got Facebook and Google, so they're lacking the advertising revenue. And to make up for that, now they go cap in hand to the government for direct subsidies, as we already have the $600 million media bailout. And then in addition to that, you have the Online News Act, which is currently before Parliament. It will pass with NDP support, and that'll directly pilfer money from Facebook and Google. I'm sure your viewers, you and myself, have very little love for Facebook and Google. But in this case, I hate to say it, they're the victims here, because money they've earned, even if we don't particularly like those companies, that's money they've earned. The Trudeau government's reaching into their pocket to take that money and just hand it to the mainstream media here. And so when this is all said and done, I think approximately 60% of the revenue for Canadian media companies is going to become owed directly by the government. Yeah. And I'll tell you, I don't think any one of our advertisers accounts for more than maybe 2 or 3% of our revenue. And I take them into account, and I try to keep our editorial and our business operations as separate as possible. But I tell you, if I had one source of revenue that was 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60%, that's going to affect my coverage. That's going to affect how tough I am.
And you hit the nail on the head there, because I think that is very much the crux of it, is the second media, instead of focusing on journalistic integrity and breaking the news and being the one to get the headline, the second they shifted from that towards dependency on the government and getting that sort of cap in hand treatment, they were bought and paid for. And I think that trajectory, every time you're bought and paid for, you're less inclined to stick towards your integrity, more inclined to go towards that. There's two potential outcomes of that. One is just the death of legacy media, and the other one is legacy media becomes the de facto state broadcaster. No one watches it anyways. I think that sort of niche of them not adhering to their journalistic principles has created very much a vacuum, and outlets like Western Standard, like Rebel News, like True North have sort of stepped into that vacuum. And I just want to get your opinion on this, sort of in closing. Do you think that the sort of reason for the success of these independent media outlets who are willing to hold these people to account is that they are sort of adhering to a more traditional journalistic responsibility?
Well, that's one of the reasons. I think there's several. One is just in the 21st century, you don't have to buy one size fits all. Mm-hmm. I grew up in a small town, or several different small little Army and Air Force towns. And if you wanted shoes, you had Walmart or like Giant Tiger. Westerners won't know what that is. That's a little small town Ontario thing.
No, but it's here now.
Yeah. Have we got Giant Tiger?
Yeah.
Oh crap, it's terrible. Unless they want to advertise, then I love them. But there wasn't a lot of options. But now, I don't even think about going to a store. I just go on Amazon. I order anything I want, and so we have more choice. In some senses now than we ever have before in humanity. The buffet is at our fingertips, and that has translated as well into the media business. So one reason for the rise of it, begins with just blogs. It used to be, remember, in the 90s, I got something to say, dang nabbit, and you just registered, you went to Blogspot or something, and you created a blog. It kind of began there, and it's just continued and continued and continued. That's a big reason. But I think the rise of organizations like the Western Standard, Rebel, True North, I mean, this is mirrored in the States as well. And but in Canada in particular, I think it is because the mainstream media outlets have gotten away from even really attempting to be seen as the honest brokers, that they're not really in the bag for everyone. They became combatants themselves.
Yeah.
And in Canada in particular, those combatants more or less crowded all to one side. Exception, I'd say, is National Post Opinion, not National Post News. National Post News is just the same as any other mainstream, really. It's just crap. But National Post Opinion, actually, I think has actually stayed very good and is kind of really separate from most of the rest of the mainstream media. I mean, they got Rex Murphy in there and John Robson, great stuff like that. But because they've all kind of segmented themselves over there, it created a vacuum. It's not like the Canadian people overnight just said, well, that's where our media went, that's where we're going. Maybe some people did, but a lot of people stayed where they were and were banned by their media, and that created a vacuum for us to fill. So all of this is terribly depressing and disheartening in one sense, and in the other sense, I look at it and I say, business opportunity.
Yeah, awesome. Well, there you have it from Derek Fildebrandt, the boss man, publisher, creator, renewer of the Western Standard. Thanks so much for joining us, and for everyone at home, I want to thank you so much for tuning in. For Rebel News, I'm Adam Soos. Independent media outlets don't reach into your pocket and take your money through your tax dollars, whether you like it or not. We instead just humbly request that you consider supporting us. Western Standard is the very same way. If you want to keep us working and you like the work that we do, I urge you to consider subscribing to Rebel News Plus. It's $8 a month, or even less if you sign up for a year. You actually get a 7-day trial so you can try it out and make sure you like it. That gives you access to our members-only shows, as well as ad-free access to our website, and it keeps us working telling these important stories. So go to rebelnews.com now and sign up for Rebel News Plus.